Welcome back. If you are following along from home, this session is number 5. The lecture is for the intermediate skill level entitled Tennessee Valley Authority Records to St. Louis and Beyond, and our speaker is Carr Moore-Lebenick. During this session, she will cover the wealth of genealogical resources maintained in the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis for the Tennessee Valley Authority official personnel files and TVA information maintained across the National Archives nationwide. Ms. Moore-Lebenick is an archives technician at the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis. I'm now turning the broadcast over to Ms. Lebenick.
Hi, this is Karen in St. Louis. We're calling in via phone because we're having some internet difficulties here on site. Really excited to be presenting. All the presentations have been really interesting today. It's always fascinating to me working in a personnel record center to see how our records connect to the other records that are held in other locations. So the virtual genealogy fair is always super interesting for me. So anyway, we're going to go on to our first slide, slide number 5, and get started with the Tennessee Valley Authority talking about records in St. Louis and beyond. Next slide, slide 5. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created in 1933 as one of the many alphabet agencies of the New Deal and employed men and women alike for many different jobs, from the well-known dam constructions to science labs and textile plants. So it's very important to have that context, because then we can have the conversation about how this is affecting everybody from the people who lived in the area to people who were coming in looking for work during this time period. It was one of the first agencies with such an overstated regional focus. Within 1 year of establishment, there's over 9,000 people who come and are employed over these 7 different areas that are affected. That includes Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. Now, this was the first government agency to really focus on this region and development and modernization, kind of updating this rural land and make it a more sophisticated area. It's certainly not the only or the first to think about the Tennessee Valley region in this way. Alvin York actually has a very popular story about coming home from the war and seeing that he was undereducated compared to the other people that he was deployed with. And so he talks about and has a story about bringing education to the area to begin with. So TVA, not the first, but the first with this kind of focus and government involvement. Because of that government involvement, of course, there are a ton of federal records that were created. And thanks to this, we have a more sophisticated way to track families from that area, from that time period, for really the first time outside of very, very local records that may not have been maintained quite as well. Next slide, slide 6. This is a map of the Tennessee Valley area. In the bottom left, you'll see Wilson Dam. That's in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. It is one of the more popular, one of the more famous dam projects for the Tennessee Valley area for the TVA. It wasn't started by the TVA, but it was finished by the TVA and kind of showed the real potential to the area. Next slide, slide 7. The Tennessee Valley area and the Tennessee Valley Authority goals kind of attack the different way that the Tennessee Valley is made up. Because there are mountains and hills and lowlands, the Appalachian chain that goes through, and the Tennessee River, there's a lot of a drainage basin that gets created, lots of regular flooding that happens, and the people in this area that were affected by all of this were mostly poor white and black families. Tennessee is very much a border state, so there are definitely white and black individuals who are living here. So because of these issues, the first of 3 major goals of the TVA are to build dams to stop the flooding and the loss of homes, lives, livestock. 2, build dams to generate electric power in order to serve low-cost electricity across the entire valley. At this point, there's not electricity in almost all of the homes in this area. And therefore, goal 3, the resulting lakes and water systems of the dams allow for water travel the length of Tennessee. So as people can now navigate the state of Tennessee using boats and barges, that means more supplies and more goods are getting out to those areas. The functions of the dams, the inevitable profitability of it, meant the TVA is a little bit more than an alphabet agency, but is actually a federal corporation, and is the first of its kind and very unique in that. Despite this, the TVA remains a public interest agency and federal corporation. The image we have on the left is a timeline of the TVA, and it's from the TVA's website as they still operate and function today. You can kind of look at the way that it's developed and changed from these original 3 goals. Next slide, slide 8. As I mentioned, the TVA is a federal corporation, and that's kind of a unique thing. So being established as a federal corporation means that arguments ripped across Congress, both for and against something that is a government-owned corporation. There's a fear of private companies taking over the unfinished dams in Muscle Shoals and not really thinking about the people who are living there. There's also a worry about, on the other side, the government having control of a profitable agency and then having an abuse of power, an abuse of eminent domain. There's certainly a history for the government pushing out people who lived on land and doing it in a certainly unfair manner. There's also worry, regardless of whether it's private or federal, over people who are being moved off of their land forcibly and coerced off of there when they're not really getting a fair deal. In the end, timing was critical for the success of the government-run Tennessee Valley Authority. The Great Depression had many looking to the government for aid and for responsibility for the care of its constituents, many largely in favor of the entire New Deal campaign, which includes the TVA. There's certainly stories from old Ben, who lived in a house where his family had lived for 7 generations, and the TVA came in and they moved not just his house, parcel by parcel, to an area that would be above the new lakes formed by the dams, but they moved the fire that historically had been burning for 7 generations from day one. There's also stories of the woman with 7 kids who's forced off of her land, and the minute they turn the corner, they just light it on fire. So there's uplifting stories, there's sad stories, there's a lot going on with the beginning of the TVA. Next slide, slide 9. The TVA was slated to be set up as a government-controlled agency, but operated like a private company, again, a federal corporation. This meant that federal employment opportunities, as well as oversight from a board of directors who are not directly employed by the federal government. On May 17, 1933, Congress passes the bill for the TVA, and by the next day, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt has signed it. That results in work beginning immediately. The government pays people for their lands, for the structures on their land. They help them move. They help them move in new equipment. They move in new technology, and they begin employing people immediately. Now, 2018, we are celebrating the incredible 85th anniversary of the TVA as it continues to exist. This image on the left, as mentioned in our previous presentation, is a CCC camp that benefited from the TVA. They were moved in and were able to build a lot of the stuff that comes with the TVA and comes with new construction and updating a rural area. The TVA has affected more than Tennessee residents, more than the TVA itself. It allows for areas like Oak Ridge and the Manhattan Project to supply power and nitrates. Private companies like the Aluminum Company of America and Reynolds Metal benefit from having power in this agency. in this area and being able to really generate some industry that the country needed at the time. There are state parks and local outdoor recreations that are now accessible because of the TVA, and there's other adjacent agencies from the New Deal, like the CCC mentioned above, and the Department of Agriculture and the Department of the Interior. And as I mentioned previously, the TVA employed more than dams. They employed scientists. They employed carpenters for home building. Lewis Hine is the photographer who took the picture on this slide, and he was hired specifically to document the first part of the TVA and to show people it's doing more than moving people off land. It's even doing more than providing electricity. He really helps tell the whole story through his pictures. There's also students, teachers, food production, fertilizer production, soil conservation, reforestation, and deforestation happening around the TVA. There's obviously a conversation that we have to have about who the government had and had not helped, paying, picking up, moving. There are graves that are going to be underwater because of the dams. Some of those get moved, they don't all get moved. So there's a conversation to be had around that as well, and whether, the sacrifices there were worth the betterment of the land and the betterment of the people ultimately. Next slide, slide 10. Here in St. Louis, we hold the official personnel folders. The National Archives holds civilian federal employee records for those who separated from service before 1952. This includes the War Department, which is the control of the construction of the Wilson Dam before the TVA steps in 1933. And unlike other New Deal agencies, the TVA is still active, which is why we have this note about service prior to 1952. There are certainly employee records with service after 1951 that exist. Those are maintained by the National Personnel Records Center Annex in Valmeyer, Illinois, specific to civilian personnel records. Handing over of OPFs for maintenance by the National Archives is certainly not mandatory. And due to the continuing operation of the TVA, they've maintained some of their own employment records and maintain their current employment records. They operate opening and continuing register of employees and applicants. It's because there are such specific skills demanded from the TVA that sometimes they refer to those registers and go back. So the TVA themselves have some of those more historic records and registers. Pictured on this slide is William Magnus. He was in the Tennessee Valley. If you can notice on the left-hand side, there's a smaller early picture of him in the military. This is a photo that he submitted. He left service many times and came back as he bounced around for better employment, and you can kind of see by the staple marks that his record was pulled again and again and again as they needed him for different projects. Next slide, slide 11. The original provisions of the TVA did not require it to adhere to the Civil Service Act. This means that they weren't required to maintain official personnel folders on employees the same way other agencies were. They did still maintain folders, though, and they're very similar to the OPFs created by other agencies, so I'm still going to call them OPFs just for simplicity. TVA OPFs can have applications, mention of family members employed, supporting evidence for employment. Like I said, there were people sought after for their expertise, so we're not just looking at laborers here. We're looking at people who are scientists. Pictured, we have Mary Ruth Belcher Boyd's publication that she wrote while she was in grad school. Her publication earned her a job, but it didn't quite earn her the same level of employment as a biologist, as she had been trained academically, but it did get her a job. Once you know more about the very specific work your ancestor may have done, you can then move on to learn more about the specific projects from other archives outside of the National Archives at St. Louis. Next slide, slide 12. This gentleman was hired in as a messenger, despite the fact that he goes on to work an chemical lab because he has a master's in chemical engineering. So he really put his nose to the grindstone, kept working through the TVA, and did move up and was able to use some of his education. So on the left, we have a photo from his official personnel folder when he starts working. On the right is a photo from a collection at the New York Public Library that shows him with two others in this lab that he ends up working in. Next slide, slide 13. These are 4 pages of an application. This is a standard application for any person employed by the TVA. The application is merry and whole, and it shows a little bit more detail. Different questions are asked on the TVA application that are maybe asked on other agency applications. There's very specific questions about her relatives, her background, who all in her family needs her as the head of household, who all her dependents are. It also asks if anybody else is already working for the TVA, which is very interesting for genealogical purposes. It's also one of the main differences between the TVA and the CSC, as I mentioned earlier. In the TVA, they're asking way more questions than the CSC requires, and because of this, these TVA records that exist are a really, really rich source for genealogical information. Next slide, slide 14. Again, we have images from an OPF here. On the left is the front cover of John W. Floyd. If you notice in the bottom right, it says relative, see file. And then on the right-hand side, we have 2 ID cards. The top one is of John W. Floyd, mentioned on the left. And below him is his brother, Thomas A. Floyd. So when you open his record and you see relative, see file, you can look through his application and see that he had actually quite a few family members. His mother was employed, and then he had 3 other brothers that were employed and a sister-in-law, all employed by the TVA. They end up working in various locations. They end up working on various projects, but because they're in this area that's been affected, they kind of get priority. And you can see also on his folder, employed, terminated, reemployed, terminated, reemployed. So you can see that he kind of follows the TVA and follows the work and is able to get these opportunities because of the TVA. Next slide, slide 15. These are a series of excerpts from OPFs that kind of highlight the different things that you can find. Obviously, there are some amazing photographs that exist. On the top, we have Violet Cotter. She is employed for quite a while with the TVA, works as a secretary, goes up to work as a higher-level clerk, and has several photos as she goes through her evolution with the TVA. Directly to the right of Violet Cotter is a page that was a scribble during Christine Page's interview. She was applying to be a nurse. The TVA is at this point employing every possible position, so they needed nurses on site for these different construction sites. Her interview note calls her a quote-unquote good nurse, and she ends up getting the job. To the right of that is a payroll department roster. These are always a great find within TVA records, especially for people who are doing larger TVA research and aren't really quite sure of individual names. They are looking at maybe a particular project and they know one person's name. When you come across a roster like this, you know everybody working on that project with her. In the bottom left, we have George W. Ninesley. He was an aerial photo civil engineer. So in his picture, he's looking down at a map. He's got a light lighting the map up. He was very accomplished and brought in specifically for his civil engineering expertise and his ability to look at an aerial photo and construct an entire urban landscape. To the right of him is Florence Hawley. She is one of the first ever anthropologists to work on dendrochronology, the ability to look at trees and tell more about the time period. An amazing feat, especially for a woman who, at this time, we're not seeing a lot of them in any field besides domestic housework. But in 1934, she goes to work for the TVA, and her expertise really helps the TVA look at this landscape and treat it appropriately and figure out what they're going to do about flooding areas right and really benefiting from the land. That said, there is a wide berth of people who are employed by the TVA. We see two strips on top of each other. One of them, the top one, says, "What's the lowest salary you'll accept for permanent work?" And this woman says, $3 per month. Below that, "What's the lowest salary you'll accept?" is $26,000 per year. So you can see that $3 per month ends up being about $36 a year. The difference is just phenomenal, that there are so many people that this TVA is affecting, and the reality of what the value they put on this kind of work monetarily is. It's an entirely new role of life for a lot of people. Next slide, slide 16. Now I want to talk about some record groups outside of National Archives in St. Louis. We've got Record Group 142, which is specific to the Tennessee Valley Authority. Those records can be found. The National Archives in Atlanta, they are one of our field archives, which means that they have records for anything the agency created in a specific area. Well, National Archives in Atlanta happens to cover the entire TVA area. That means that they have 268 different series for the federal registries created in this area, and a lot of that's going to adhere to the TVA, all of the administrative paperwork that's created out of this area. They're going to have that entire holding. The Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library, they have papers relevant to the TVA created during his time in public office, kind of the rule of presidential libraries. They hold records created by a president during his public office time period. So it's not really particular to LBJ because FDR happened to start not just the TVA, but presidential libraries themselves. All of our presidential libraries will potentially have records relating to the TVA because it's an agency that continues to exist and continues to develop through history into today. National Archives here in St. Louis, we have the OPFs prior to 1952. Again, I want to stress that those records only are for those who are federally employed. Somebody like Dr. Morgan, who is one of the very first board of directors, we don't have a record for him. He's not a federal employee. He is on the other side of that line when we go into federal corporation serving for the board. So that's an important distinction that I want to make sure I drive home. The individual pictured on the right, Gordon R. Clapp, he worked for the TVA for quite a while. If you look at the card below it, that's called a service record card, and it highlights his TVA career. And if you look at this very last entry, in 1946, he's terminated, but because he's appointed to the board of directors by presidential order. So his federal employee record ceases at that moment, and he moves into a different area. So that kind of highlights and shows why there's that separation, and again, that there is a separation. The National Personnel Records Center, CPR, in Valmeyer, Illinois, they hold our records after 1952 that have been released to the National Archives. Again, the TVA still keeps their records as well. Next slide, slide 17. A continuation for Record Group 142. The National Archives at College Park, the cartographic area, they hold a lot of the maps that have been created by the TVA. As they do their planning, they go through developments of area. It's something that still happens today. So they will have records that go past the 1951 area, the time period that I highlighted in the official personnel folders. But as we saw, there were definitely people who were looking at civil engineering in kind of a new way for this area, and the cartographic area is going to have all of those maps. National Archives at College Park Still Pictures Department, they have a complete collection of Lewis Hines photographs. They're available digitally. the very, very rich area to look at. He, in particular, was a great hire for the TVA because he documents images like the one on the right here. This is the family of Hugh No, a renter on a farm near Andersonville, Tennessee. He not only goes through the TVA and documents people living in their normal day-to-day life, he documents the constructions that's happening, he documents the new areas that's coming. There's pictures of like culturally significant hangouts that happened. There's also pictures of families. There's pictures of the CCC camps like we saw earlier. And he had such a relationship with this area and with these people that he provides very detailed captions like this. Again, that collection is available digitally. You can get to them from our national catalog. And then finally, the National Archives at College Park Motion Picture Department, they have a few films of the TVA and its development and the different ways that you can kind of look at the TVA and how it was documented through motion pictures. Next slide, slide 18. I wanted to bring some attention to the National Archives catalog, which is a very great resource. Sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming to get into. So I wanted to show you that you can go to archives.gov/research/catalog. And in this, you can search specifically for the Tennessee Valley Authority. When you do that search, it will bring up anything that has TVA mentioned in its metadata, and it'll show you all the different areas you can get to that have records containing the TVA. Next slide, slide 19. These are some screen grabs that show you some of the information that you can use to filter and refine and figure out where to ultimately send your request for these TVA records within the National Archives. On the left, you can refine by the data source, the level of description, the type of material. Again, I mentioned the cartographic is maps and charts. If that's the area you're looking into, all those maps and charts are available. You can see there's 28 in the parentheses next to it. That's going to show you that there's 28 different series that apply both Tennessee Valley Authority and maps and charts. You can select any one of those hyperlinks and it's going to refine your search. You can refine by location. There's a whole bunch more as you scroll down on the left-hand column that'll help you kind of search through and refine what you're looking for. Of course, textual records is gigantic. There's a ton of them, but there's a lot of other types of records. On the right, the top image is a brief description of the record itself. This one I chose was Lewis Hines photographs for the Tennessee Valley Authority. He only worked for the TVA for 1 month in 1933, so that's why the time frame is 1933 to 1933. This is his digital collection. It gives you the archives identifier, the creator, what group it's from. All of that information really helps the National Archives employees, particularly me sometimes. So with that extra information, we can know exactly what you looked at so that we know we're getting what you want. And then below that, at the very bottom of the entry, you scroll all the way down. Sometimes there's a lot of information in the metadata. It's a contact information. So for example, the National Archives at St. Louis, you can contact us by phone, you can reach us by fax, you can reach us by physical postal mail, and you can reach us by email. And then get your request to us in a bunch of different ways, and just know that there's so many different ways you can contact us. Sometimes there'll be multiple contacts listed in these National Archive catalog entries. That just means that those records are in multiple places. So we'll have a portion of it, somebody else can have a portion of it. It really just kind of depends, but it certainly helps you as the researcher to know there might be multiple places for something, and definitely like who you're writing into can be very helpful. Next slide, slide 20. So the National Archives outside of 142, like I said, 142 is the specific series that was created for Tennessee Valley Authority records, but FDR doesn't actually fall underneath that. So the Franklin Delano Presidential Library has papers relevant to the creation and execution during his time in office. Those papers are going to be particular to him and his cabinet and the different people who worked in his administration. Harry S. Truman Library is another one that's not within 142, but it has papers relevant to the TVA during his time in public office. Again, presidential libraries, most of ours will have relevant papers just because of the ongoing nature of the TVA and the fact that presidential libraries have existed the entire time the TVA has. Their timeline is very congruent. There's going to be correspondence and individual records at most, if not all, of the presidential libraries. So those are going to fall within the accordance of the Presidential Records Act and all the variations that it experiences. That's how those records are created. Next slide, slide 21. There are Tennessee Valley records, Tennessee Valley Authority records outside of the National Archives, of course. Part of that comes from the fact that it's a federal corporation, so it's not all federally owned and operated. There's a little bit of outside going on as well. The TVA itself, great resource to start with. They maintain their website, tva.gov, very helpful. It's where I pulled that timeline from at the beginning. University of Tennessee, our anthropologist we mentioned earlier, she worked alongside the University of Tennessee and a lot of its employees, but because they were working on behalf of the university, we won't have those records. The university maintains them. As a general rule of thumb, I'm sure all of you genealogists know this, but state historical societies are excellent archives. They are going to maintain anything that happened in their state that was turned over to them. A little bit smaller level, county historical societies, courthouses have paperwork, local historical societies, museums, libraries, archives independently. There's just a plethora of different archives that you can use to access anything that happens in and of the area. It's kind of true for most agencies and for most happenings in a general way. The CCC has records, as mentioned, in universities. The WPA is the same way. It's not particular for New Deal agencies, but again, just kind of a rule of thumb. And next slide. This is a particular to, slide 22, sorry, particular to requesting records from the National Archives at St. Louis. If service ends after 1952, they're not open to the public, and they're only open to the employee, the next of kin, or the service agency itself, so the TVA. These are appraised to be permanent, but they're not released by OPM at this time. So those records are responded to by the National Personnel Records Center Annex. I have a link there that's going to send you to their website, send more information about requesting those records. If you're not really sure when the end of service is, you can always send it to us by default, and we'll check first if we don't have it here. Because they operate as an annex of us, we can send the record right over there, the request right over to them, and they will certainly handle it for you. Because our records are completely open to the public, that means that there's a fee associated with them. We have reproduction fees. If the entire record is 5 pages or less, it's only $25. If it's more than 5 pages, it's a flat $70. We also have an on-site research room available for folks. So if they wanted to come look at the record themselves, they're certainly free to make an appointment. So you can send an email to stlARR.archives@nara.gov to set up an appointment that way. Next slide, 23. That's it. Ready for questions?
Thank you, Kara. Appreciate your covering the TVA so thoroughly. So we do have some questions for you that came throughout your presentation. So let's get started. Let's see. This is about finding photographs. This person has very specific information, but he was a Pullman porter in Chicago until his death. What might be the best approach to see if he was ever photographed?
Was he a Pullman porter for the TVA? Did they specify?
The full question is my great uncle, and he gives the dates and where he lived, was a Pullman porter in Chicago, 1910 until his death. No, it does not say if this person was for the TVA, but that's my assumption.
I'll answer it both ways. If they were an employee for the TVA, the best way to find out if there was a photograph with him associated with the TVA is to send us his name and date of birth and agency employment information, and we'll just do a search for the record. If you ask specifically for a photo, we'll let you know in our records response whether or not we located one as well as the record. If you're asking about photographs in a kind of general way, that's obviously a little bit more difficult to answer. I would say start with Chicago local libraries. They have a ton of public libraries, and their archives are really interesting, and their employees are very nice and are happy to help. So I would say contact local, go as far down local to start as possible to find out about different employment or maybe like marriage licenses, birth certificates, any kind of vital records that will help provide information about his life. Then you can kind of start going out to see whether or not he would have encountered a situation where his photograph was taken.
Thank you. Thank you for the thorough answer. Let's see, the next one. Does each agency a civil service employee worked for under the Civil Service Commission at an Army Signal Depot location, for example, have a separate OPF, or are these combined as one federal OPF? So it sounds like the person's asking, are you going for, if they go from agency to agency, does each agency have an OPF, or is there one combined?
The answer is yes and no. Each agency will create its own official personnel folder to start with. Oftentimes when they move from agency to agency, the new hiring agency will request evidence of previous employment. So that will be part of the new record. Sometimes if they go from agency to agency and their employment ends after 1952, it's possible that they have been put in what's called a consolidated agency record, in which case they've already been combined when we accessioned them. So that acts as one folder. But it doesn't always happen like that. Each agency creates that record to begin with up until more modern times. Now they're combined into one. So if you're looking for somebody, like if you're looking for your own record and you work for several agencies, you only have one record at this point because they've been combined in our registry. But each agency creates a different one to begin with. Sorry, this is a very long answer. When we encounter somebody who maybe worked for the Army Signal Depot and then went on to work for the Department of Commerce, and there's two separate folders, that means there's two separate employing agencies, and then it also incurs two separate charges for each agency record.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. And that answers another question that we had. So one more question for now. Let's see. Like many projects, did people employed in the TVA come from local workers or migrants coming in from around the country or the world?
Both. There were certainly local people who were employed because they were the ones right there and ready to go. But like Florence Hawley and George Neely, they were both migrant in the sense that they moved to work specifically for the TVA because of their areas of expertise. Lewis Hines, his OPF is super interesting because he specifically says, I've been training my whole life to work on a project like this, and he petitioned to work for the TVA because he wanted to document that, and he traveled for it. So if you were an area of expertise, then they were more migrant, but the majority of them were local.
Thank you. So we have a follow-up question to your previous answer. So is it acceptable to request an agency record held by NARA even if you have an OPF?
Can you ask that again? I'm sorry.
They ask, is it acceptable to request an agency record held by the National Archives, even if you have an OPF?
Can you request somebody else's record, or
Yeah.
agency records like a administrative record that's not a personnel record?
They have not given us more information. Is it possible that you could answer it both ways?
Absolutely. So the records that are held at the National Archives at St. Louis are completely open to the public. You can request any individual's record. It does not matter. They're totally open. If you're requesting somebody else's record who worked after 1952 or after 1951, you can request them. They're subject to FOIA and the Privacy Act, so only a limited amount of information may be releasable, if anything at all. It doesn't matter if you were a federal employee or not. And if you're looking for agency records about like administrative details, then, I mean, there's no restriction except for the FOIA and Personal Privacy Act.
Thank you, Kara. It looks like that ends our questions for you. Thank you so much.